everyone, and welcome to this Infosecurity Magazine interview with me, Beth Mondrell. And today I am joined by James Blake, who is the Global Head of Cyber Resiliency Strategy for Cohesity. So, James, thank you so much for joining us today. And today we're going to be discussing the theme of rebuilding and preventing future cyber attacks and some practical steps for organizations to be taking today. So, first of all, James, let's kind of lay the land a little bit. And we know there's been a significant shift from data theft to destructive ransomware attacks. So, kind of the way attackers are approaching these incidents and acting has changed. So, how can organizations start to think about their cybersecurity strategies and adapt them to address the evolving threat landscape?
Yeah, I think if, yeah, as you said yourself, the last 20 or 30 years, if I go back to my days as a CISO, all I had to worry about was data theft, right? And it's not really theft. You've still got a copy of the data to continue to run the business and deliver products and services. So, really we had the luxury of time to do our incident response. But now, when we've gone into destructive attacks like ransomware and also wiper attacks as well, we don't have that luxury. Like every second we're down, we're accruing, lost revenue, potential litigation, regulatory fines, and all the things that we had for data theft as well. But that means that we really need to focus on response as well. And the movement from adversaries moving to ransomware as a service means that we have way more adversaries than we've ever had before. And also, those ransomware as a service operators have pivoted from using things like phishing into targeting vulnerabilities. And we all know we can't patch quick enough. The old story of, Microsoft Tuesday, exploit Wednesday, right? They're exploiting within 4 days. So we really need to move to this position of resilience, from a position of believing that we can stop all attacks. And I spent 20 years of my life, building socks and trying to stop attacks. But the reality is we need to focus on resilience now.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up that vulnerability angle as well. It's not just about the kind of traditional attacks and phishing and social engineering, but these vulnerabilities are so widespread. And it seems like one of the biggest issues that we're really facing today.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the MOVEit vulnerabilities. There's people targeting, edge networking infrastructure as well. And if we look, I think there was a statistic released by, I think it was Stairwell, the company, and it takes the average enterprise 128 days to patch a critical vulnerability in an internet-facing app. And we're looking at people taking 4 days to weaponize vulnerabilities, because those people that run the ransomware as a service platforms, they're taking a 20% cut of every single one of their affiliates' actions. That's a lot of money. And they're investing that back into the platform. And obviously, they've added password spraying, credential stuffing as well into their tactics. So, our focus on social engineering and training users only goes so far, because they still do phishing as well. But we've got this much broader attack surface that ransomware as a service is enabling.
Yeah. So, on that resiliency angle, then, um, business continuity, you kind of talked about how, as soon as an incident happens, you're losing money. Things are obviously can stop operationally. So, business continuity is essential, and you need to have good disaster recovery plans. How can organizations ensure these plans are kind of tailored to some of the challenges that we've mentioned there, like data theft being a thing of the past and it's just being destructive? You've got all these vulnerabilities to deal with. Where does that resiliency kind of piece come in? I think that's a word we're hearing a lot at the moment as well.
We are, but I don't think people quite understand what it means. So there's an awful lot of people that focus on recovery, right, as a part of resilience. And the challenge is, if we look at business continuity and disaster recovery scenarios, the typical ones that IT were responsible for: flood, fire, misconfiguration, loss of power, equipment failure. You can count the root cause on one hand, right? And it's fairly easy to diagnose the root cause. I walk into a data center and it's hot, it's probably on fire. If it's dark, there's no power. If my feet are wet, it's a flood. But, what businesses have done is they've gone out and said, well, applications are down. This is a business continuity issue. And often they've engaged the IT team without the security team. And I see this as a repeating theme in even some of the largest customers I work with. So IT, they're used to just recovering the last backup and putting that back into service. The challenge is we don't understand the root cause of the attack. How did they get in? What gaps did I have in my controls? Did they exploit a vulnerability that needs patching? And, are there any persistence mechanisms in there? Have they added authentication, third-party authentication providers? So, we are seeing a repeated pattern, and there's a couple of large ransomware attacks that have been in the news where, without calling the companies out, but they've recovered and then got hit again. And, that is a repeated pattern we see in people that have an IT only and a BCDR orientated strategy towards cyber resilience. And it's a big mistake that needs to be corrected. We need IT and security together working on this.
Yeah. So, what are some of the things that organizations should be thinking about to kind of bring IT and security together in terms of the point that you just made?
Well, if I go back to my days, I used to run a quite large consulting practice building security operation centers for HP Enterprise for a number of years. And when I was there, it is the fact that you understand that you need to investigate, right? You need to investigate and mitigate the threats before you go into recovery, right? So that is a task that sits with security clearly. And then IT are responsible for mitigating the threats that have been discovered by the IT, either through rebuilding or restoring systems and then cleaning them. But there's another component to this as well, and that is the fact in destructive ransomware attacks, they've probably evaded your security solutions, but also on top of that, they may have totaled your organization. So when I used to rock up to do incident response in some of these companies, and you couldn't get in the front door because the door access control system has been wiped, you couldn't authenticate to any of your security tools, which have been flattened anyway. And then there was no telephones, no email. How do you contact law enforcement and your insurer and, comply with all the regulations that we now have around, NIS2 and DORA and the PRA to an SEC to notify the victims of the attack whose data has been stolen. So, what we used to do is build a clean room. And a clean room concept, isolated environment. A lot of the data management vendors will call it an isolated recovery environment, but so much more has to happen than just recovery in that environment. The first thing we need to do is stand up that capability to respond. So get trusted tooling, things back to a trusted state, that communications and collaboration capability, so you can talk to execs, external third parties, and the people rolling the incident. So get that stood up as quickly as possible. The next thing is this clean room concept, which really has two parts. One is an investigatory environment in which you find out the root cause of the incident. So you can find out what you need to patch, what you need to bolster, what you need to remove. And then you have a recovery environment, which is also isolated, which is where the IT teams can then either rebuild from those golden masters and known good configurations that you've made available at the beginning, or they can recover from their backups and then clean the badness out of those backups and then test, because you don't know if the mitigations bring in third-party problems, and then put them back into production and then rinse and repeat, get this going, because you have different categories of importance of interdependent systems to deliver your business applications. So this is something we used to do, on the fly. You'd rock up at a customer in the middle of an incident and go, okay, give me a couple of extra servers, and configure your network this way. That is not the time to do it. And we all know preparedness is the most important part of resilience. So getting that clean room environment and that minimum viable response capability and the staging room for IT to clean systems, getting all those established so it's just like that. and muscle memory when you need to turn it on.
So, how would you go about kind of simulating this, like in terms of getting yourself ready so that you can have that muscle memory response when something does happen? What's like the approach there? Because someone listening might be like, "Oh, well, that all sounds very great once it's all in place, but how do I actually start? And how do I start a simulation? Who do I need to get involved? How do I approach that?"
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is having realistic desktop simulations. And I'm incredibly frustrated because I say I'm on the other side of the fence, coming from a team that used to do incident response. I get invited by customers to sit into some of their desktop ransomware simulations being run by consultancy firms, consultants that have never rolled an incident, right? And I listen to how inaccurate some of the scenarios are. Like, we'll pay a ransom. Okay, if you're going to pay a ransom to get your data back, what is your logistical method for getting those keys out when your comms are down? You know, can you trust your end users to enter those keys? How long is that going to take? More importantly, have you looked for sanctions on the people you're about to pay? Because the Office of Foreign Asset Control will give you 30 years in prison if you ever visit Disneyland and land in the US. Luckily, in the UK, we only put you in prison for 7 years. But you probably get released early anyway, looking at what's happened
Yeah.
recently. But but these things are not built into this, right? And we created the ransomware resiliency uh, workshop that we do with customers that really walks through what a realistic one looks like. So start with that accurate desktop depiction of what's going to go on. The second thing is, if you build a clean room and minimum viable response and staging room capability in advance, you're able to test that, right? You're able to just once a month, once a quarter, whatever you want to do, not just test the workflow in a desktop scenario, but one of the advantages we have as Cohesity is you can clone a production environment very, very easy. Clone a production environment, then encrypt it. Right? And then in that instance, roll your full clean room, right? Test your procedures, test the integrations, for instance, between Cohesity and your security ops tooling to help you do that incident response and that recovery.
It's interesting that you mention about thinking about the ransomware payment side of things. And I think this is a whole nother debate that we could have. But I've got some of the stats that your team provided to me before we logged on today. And you did a report recently that found that 74% of those that were surveyed by Cohesity said they would pay a ransom to recover their data after an attack, and 59% had paid a ransom. Firstly, does that surprise you? Those high numbers of people kind of willing to pay or think about paying or indeed paying at all? And how does it fit into those kind of plans that you need to make when you're thinking, this is how I'm going to deal with an incident?
I think going back to what I said at the beginning, this treating it like a BCDR incident is endemic in even larger organizations. So what happens, people say, I haven't got a policy to pay the ransom, but then they go to get their backup and their backup has been encrypted, right? That's a very common scenario. The other one is they go to get their backup and then they suddenly realize that their backup, uh, they the quality of it is terrible, or the other challenge that they have is they recover the backup then get hit again. And I have stories of customers recovering 15, 17 times, right, and getting hit immediately because they haven't baked the incident response and mitigation process into their cyber recovery. They just treat cyber recovery like it's flood, fire and everything else. So I think that's the doesn't surprise me at all, considering some of the conversations I have, in our customers, when they're first considering going with Cohesity. A large thing that we do, and it's part of my role, is to go out with their CISO, because I'm a peer, I've been a CISO and everything else, and have those conversations. Not just say, look, it's not just product, right? You need to have the right approach to using us and the right processes in place in order to be successful and achieve those kind of low days, hours, RTOs that you're trying to achieve. And then often we have to negotiate to get the security team to the table to have a conversation with us alongside the IT team that have initially brought us in.
So, James, one thing you've mentioned a couple of times, and I think maybe worth explaining for anyone watching, is that minimum viable response capability. It sounds maybe a little buzzwordy, but what does that mean for anyone that's watching and thinking about their incident response and readiness? And what are the kind of steps they should be thinking about to make sure they do have a minimum viable response capability?
Yeah, so if I go back to my days, working as a retained incident responder, we used to have a jump bag, right? So it was a physical bag, and inside that bag, we had external hard disks, USB keys, install media, laminated contact lists of everyone that in my team that I needed to work with. I would have detailed printed out workflows, so regardless of which customer I went in, and if their systems were down, I didn't need internet access, I just had access to that. The concept of minimum viable response capability is bringing that into the 21st century, to the world we live in today. So, from a Cohesity perspective, how I've built this here is we have an immutable data store that does not sit on your core infrastructure. So it doesn't sit with the same authentication methods. It doesn't sit in the same environment where it can be targeted by an adversary. And effectively, you store all of those components in there. So, I mentioned the staging room area earlier, which is where your IT team rebuild those interdependent applications to clean them or rebuild them from the ground upwards and test them. Well, where's the network configuration or VMware configuration to enable you to do that? All of the reinstallation of your door access control system, authentication systems. And the idea being is we store this in this place where it can't be targeted by an adversary and it's a trusted version. And we can make that available within minutes to a customer so that they can start that process of recovery of just the ability to respond, because it's a bit backwards these days where we're very used to protect, detect, respond, recover, but actually in destructive attacks we need to recover the ability to respond before we respond. So minimum viable response capability, nothing to do with recovering business applications, everything about making sure that you trust what is happening within your environment you're using to respond.
Great. Thank you for that, James. I think that was important to dive into there. And it's interesting that you say everything's a bit backwards. I think sometimes we think about all the processes and plans that have been talked about, but a lot of the time with things changing as they have, like we talked about the destructive attacks becoming increasingly a tactic for cyber criminals, those methods that have been baked into us, maybe we do really need to kind of start looking beyond them and being a bit more innovative with our approaches. But given everything we have spoken about today, then, and we're talking about resiliency and response, for anyone watching that's thinking, okay, there's a few things in this that they haven't maybe considered before. Maybe that's the simulation. Maybe that is the minimum viable response capability. Maybe they haven't sat down and thought, would we pay the ransom? What are the immediate steps you think organizations should be taking if they're uncertain about any of those questions or about their cyber resiliency overall?
Well, I think there's three to just very briefly. I mean, the first one, I think it's the IT and security teams working together. Absolutely essential. Like, understand that you need to investigate the incident, find root cause, mitigate the threats, and that's before recovery, right? So, starting at recovery is never a good approach, right? For data and complete systems, outside of the minimum viable recovery process. So have those dialogues ahead of an incident, because there is this, getting a desktop exercise working, there's the reality of all the technology and roles and everything that's involved. So those simulations, absolutely, you mentioned earlier, the ransomware workshop rerun, which is usually at an exec level, but then the execs typically ask us to come back and do ones within their organization with the operational teams as well. I think the next thing is for CIOs to understand that their backups can be targeted, so need to protect their backups. This is absolutely critical. Everyone calls it the last line of defense. But the third point is not the last line defense. There is a lot of information in backup. It's not seen as sexy for security people, but it is, right? As someone that spent 10 years building SOCs for some of the world's largest organizations, there is so much information in a backup. Forensics. We're so used to imaging a system in its end state and guessing how it got there. I can now see a file system over time through snapshots and see all the changes that happened on that file system. Incredibly useful for looking for files that have changed in the last couple of days or had permissions changed, all of these forensics things. And we don't, it's an untapped resource. It's already sat within your IT department. They've done the hard work putting the data in it. The other thing is, we're used to endpoint security these days. We're heavily reliant on EDR and XDR. Great, I love EDR, XDR. I used it in all my investigations, but it's liable to defense evasion. Right? It sits on an endpoint. Right? The clue's in its name. So, this ability to hunt for IOCs and do forensics and, in a way that can't be evaded, right? Because you're not doing it on the platform that the target has got access to. So there's some utility in backups in being able to use in hunting and data classification. When your original data is encrypted, how do you find out what data to comply with your regulatory obligations are on their system? Well, the backup's still got a copy of it. And I think finally, the one thing about EDR and XDR is what's the first thing you do in a ransomware incident? Containment. You cut the system off from the network. And what though most EDR and XDR solutions, at least when you go into query and response, rely on a network connection. So, backup gives you this ability to ask questions of the data that are useful in incident response without actually having to have the production systems up. And I think when CISOs, I spend my time opening their eyes to that, and they're like, oh my God, don't need to deploy another agent. I've got access to all this stuff that I'd love in a data lake, but I'd have to run it. But all of this information is available in the backup if CISOs could just use it.
Some really good advice there. I think that's an interesting point as well about some of the other tools that might be things that you're using that actually you need to think about what happens when an incident happens. How useful are those tools to you? A lot of food for thought there for anyone watching those. So thank you so much, James, for taking the time to speak with me today. And I think that resiliency is really going to continue to be a theme within the industry. So I think some really good tips there, and hopefully anyone watching can take away. We will include some of the resources, so some of the stuff about ransomware simulation and that report statistics I mentioned in the notes of this interview. So make sure you check those out. But thank you to everyone for watching, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thanks, James.
Thank you very much.